Bum, bum, bum. We're live.
We're live.
I love starting the conversations out with something dorky because it's just totally my nature to just be weird. Be weird and goofy and dorky. It's just me.
We're
How are
live.
you,
That's good.
Marcus?
Pretty good. Pretty good. Yeah. So I've actually been busy with like content. So I am working
Amazing.
on that not so secret projects that you and I talked about the other day.
Ooh.
Which yeah, it's to do with DevRel education. In case folks don't know. And yeah, so I've been kind of like heads down creating content. I love creating content. Okay, it's like it's this weird thing where like it's two things. So it's either coding or creating content that I just kind of like forget about everything else, and I'm just kind of like doing it, and then suddenly it's like 11:30 p.m. and I'm like typing in and but yeah, I love doing it. So yeah, it's been great. Yeah, it's been great. So I really can't complain. How about
Oh,
you?
pretty good. Just to kind of follow up with that, I feel the same way. I honestly feel like, especially what you're working on, I find that type of content to be very therapeutic. Like just sort of being able to, it's not even necessarily like dump is a bad word, but being able to sort of like write those thoughts down, right? And then formulate
Yeah,
them in a very organized manner. And I don't know, I guess since the beginning of tested time, honestly, like I've always been this type of person where I'm like, how do I make your life easier, right? Like, how do
yeah,
I share what I know so that you can have it just a little bit easier than maybe I had it? And so I fully agree with that. Whether, like you said, code or writing, I think it's just therapeutic. Now that you say that, now I'm like, I need to go write because I'm just in a weird headspace. I think I just need to go write, you know?
yeah, yeah. And I also find that what are you reading now, Tessa? Are you reading anything? Like, are you reading a book or anything?
I am actually someone who was on my podcast and who's in the
Hmm.
developer ecosystem sent me this book called Bring It Out.
Huh.
Yeah, by Ben Pilgreen. I'm only just a little bit in. Oops. Just a tiny bit in. You can't even see my little bookmarker there. But it's about how to cultivate unique gifts and assignments that you've been given. Essentially, this idea of we all have skills and gifts that we've been given, and like, how do you figure out what those are and then, do good with those things? So,
Nice. Nice.
yeah. How about
I
you?
I am so I'm reading a book called The One Thing, and it's basically like it's very specific to this. So the premise of the book is when you're running a business, or when you're, in my case, for running a business, but like when you're working on something or building something, you focus on that one thing, and you focus on that one thing that will
Mm,
make you successful. And basically, as long as you follow through with that one thing, then you will feel successful. Like, you get to the end of it and you will feel successful. um, and it's about kind of like just focusing on one thing, because we have distractions everywhere. Like, there's distractions with like a bunch of things. And like, just being able to focus on the one thing, and also getting that sense of accomplishment when you do that thing, just feels pretty great. And it's not like you're gonna focus on one thing for like the rest of your life. It's like for periods of time. So I'm reading that one book, and then I have
mm.
another one called Blue Ocean, which I just got it now. And it's one that I had, like, it's been like very, very highly recommended. It's that concept of like blue ocean, red ocean. And yeah, so that's the one in the queue. By the way,
Mhm.
one thing about me is I mostly read 52 books a year. And 52 books is like, because a year has those, like, 52 weeks, and I usually try and stick to like one book a week. um so yeah, I'm always reading.
Hmm. I feel like I should implement something like that, but man, I gotta turn off the sounds on my phone. But between like four kids and a farm and working and all the things, I'm like, it's the one thing that gets deprioritized in my life is like anything related to, well, anything I personally honestly want to do. Um, I apologize. I'm trying to like find the sounds, turn off
No,
the
it's
sounds on
okay.
my phone. Um, yeah, because I don't have the time capacity to, get it all in. Like I barely have the time capacity to go to the gym, and I feel like I should prioritize that higher than reading a book, but you could argue not. Both healthy
I
for
mean,
you, right?
I was gonna say, my sort of like my trick to it is like I always find time to go to the gym. So if I find time to go to the gym, then I can always listen to a book, which is what I do at the gym. Okay, so like
Smart.
a lot of my 52 books that I say I read, I actually listen to it rather
Mm,
than like just sitting down reading because of the exact same thing. Like I
yeah.
have a book that is like I always also have an other book that is always kind of like next to my bed, and this is like my sort of like going to sleep kind of book. Um,
Mm.
but I never really get much time to go through it. So I'm always like reading at least two books at a time, because like there's the one that I listen to, and then there's this one that is always like on the sides of my bed. But that one doesn't get much attention because I start reading, and it's not that it's boring. It's just that I'm tired. Like when I go to bed, I want to sleep.
Yep.
So like I read a little bit of it, and then I fall asleep. Um, but what I like about it is it stops me from doing TikTok,
Smart.
because otherwise I am gonna do TikTok before bed, and then you know how it is. It's like it's that kind of like weird sleep and weird dreams and everything, and like I just books.
Yes. It's so interesting that you say that. We started watching The Chosen, and so, like, the only time that we have time to actually watch TV is, like, right before we go to bed. And so in the
Hmm.
middle of the night, I, like, have all these, like, very vivid and weird dreams about, like, Jesus's scriptures and other things,
Yeah.
which they're not bad dreams. I'm appreciating it, but at the same time, I'm like, "Okay, I have to, like, take a little bit of a brain break before I
Yeah.
go to sleep because they're just, like, too vivid." Like, I woke up
Yeah.
at, like, 3 a.m., like, wide awake, and I'm like, "Okay, that's interesting." So
Yeah.
yeah, a book might be better. Honestly, I really am not chipping away at this Bring It Out book, and I wanted to just knock it out in the weekend that I got it, and I still haven't yet. So maybe that's what I need to shift to is reading the book before bed.
Yeah. Yeah. It's good. Like it's a good habit, and it definitely changes how I like. I've got the little like app on my phone that tracks how I sleep,
Mm,
and
mhm.
definitely you can tell the difference between like when I read a book and when I
Mm.
do like some TikTok.
Yep.
Just because like the, my sleeping patterns, they just kind of like differ so much. But
Mm.
yeah, so it's almost like reading a book kind of like
Soothes you.
relaxes my yeah, like it
Yeah.
relaxes my brain. Whereas like with TikTok, it's all that dopamine and everything, and you're like, okay, so now it's time to bed, and it's like 1 a.m. and I'm still kind of like doom scrolling here, like I can't be doing this. So yeah,
Yep.
yeah, try that.
I'm going to. Okay, that's a good idea.
Mhm.
So we in these conversations we started doing these, right? So for anyone who hasn't caught up with us or watched the first one, we just had these regular check-ins with each other, like how are you doing in your business? What are you up to? Just generalized check-ins. And so we decided a lot of the stuff we talked about was really, really, really good for DevRel practitioners or anyone who wanted to learn about DevRel. So, long story short, that's the essence of how this originated. And I wanted to see, I wanted to bring up a topic, and we can talk about it as long as we want to. And we talked about a lot of things last time, so we'll see what kind of rabbit holes we get ourselves into this time.
Mhm.
But two times this week, I have had conversations with different people who are looking for work. Um, Honestly, more on the software engineering side and wanting to get in DevRel, which obviously is a difficult thing right now, right, with the economic climate in general, but also with DevRel roles, and they are getting more prominent now. But a few months ago, they were very few and far between. So,
Yep.
anyways, in those conversations, they've been interested in understanding what DevRel is, kind of what buckets it falls into, and I'm really curious to hear how you talk about this or how you frame it, or if you've had these conversations with people who aren't in DevRel and like what you share with them, because I've had it twice now and I'm like, gosh, it just feels like a topic that we should cover, that we can send people back to.
Yeah. I mean, I can give you my take.
Would love your take.
I, I had this conversation with someone not long ago. I think not long ago, as in like sometime last week.
Mm,
And this person, he approached me and he was like, "Look, I am. I think I'm going on a path where I am. going to be working in DevRel. So like I have this kind of like this good thing going with this company. They like me. I do videos, and they like my videos, and they want to bring me in as DevRel. Now, unfortunately, I don't know anything about DevRel. So like I'm reaching out to you because like I know you've got the experience. I've seen your LinkedIn posts and everything. So I just wanted to know more. And usually what I tell people is it's it's weird because I don't actually recommend, and I think one of your comments will kind of like unfold here when I say this. I don't usually recommend people who are these like um, very, how do I put this? Um, if you're a software engineer and your thing is writing code day in and day out, DevRel is probably not for you. Now, the reason I
Okay.
say this is because a lot of the code and a lot of the work that we do in DevRel is not necessarily the type of code that goes into production.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to work with someone who, like, the way they put it, which was very interesting. And again, like, um, I'm going back to Stack Overflow days, okay, where I know like there's not a lot of people using Stack Overflow now, but the way this person used to put it was, your code may not be deployed to production by you, but certainly when you go on Stack Overflow and you answer a question to someone, that code's most likely going to be copied and pasted, and it will end up in production. So your code just ends up going to production by proxy. But the reality is, like, if what you're stoked about is just like writing code, um, and writing unit tests and just kind of like just being this kind of like developer, then DevRel may not be for you. Whereas, like, if you're interested in trying new things, or if you're interested in helping people creating content or creating codes or like building things, then DevRel may be for you. So that's kind of like the differentiation I give to people, especially people coming from a software engineering background. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
like the way I ended up in DevRel was I was a software engineer for many years, and then I got to a point where I was like, look, I like being a software engineer, but I'm really tired of using Jira. So like in a way, I feel like Jira kind of like got me into DevRel. I'm sorry.
That
Um,
is very entertaining.
yeah, and who knows? Maybe if Linear existed back then I would still be a software engineer. Who knows?
Who
Um,
knows? That'd be
but
sad for the DevRel world.
I but yeah, so I just got really tired of using Jira, and I got really tired of the whole like, uh, you know, um, sprints and retros and like stand-ups and everything, and I got tired of this, and I was like, I actually really like the idea of just being on a more like educational path. I've
Mm-hmm.
always liked the educational path. Okay, like and I'll just tell this story like really quickly. So there was this many years ago. So I grew up in Brazil, okay, and many years ago, before I moved to England, which is where I live now, I've been in England for 20 years. um, I wanted to be a software engineer, and I was learning this programming language called Cold Fusion back then, okay, which probably speaks for my age. But I was learning this programming language called Cold Fusion, and then I was like, I want to get really good at Cold Fusion. So I went to this school, and this was like a small school, and I had a conversation with like one of the instructors, and the instructor was like, I don't think there's much we can teach you like from the curriculum we have, but we are looking for a teacher, like we are looking for an instructor.
Mm.
And I was like, oh, I don't know about this. Like I was coming here to be a student, not an instructor. And he goes, well, I've been, and I was writing blogs back then, like I had a blog
Mhm.
back then. And he was like, let me just have a look at your stuff. And it was like, I think you could be a instructor. So long story short, I went from like looking to be a student to being an instructor. Like, I'm not going to speak for
Mm.
like how good an instructor I was, but that was kind of like my first experience with like education. And then I went
Mhm.
on to be a software engineer for many years. And then once I had the opportunity to kind of like move into education, I was like, yeah, that's what I want. Like I really love that time. So again, I would say, if if you're if what you're stoked about is being a software engineer and that's all that gets you excited, then DevRel is not going to do it for you.
Mhm.
Um, but if you do like the educational sides of things, then I'd say that's probably something you could go for. As long as you don't feel like you're missing out too much on not writing like production code, like eight, 8 to 10 hours a day.
Yeah. Well, so many things to unpack in there. I really
Yeah,
locked
sorry,
it into
I
your
feel
thing.
like I
Oh,
just
no, no,
went
that was
around
good.
so much. Yeah, but
No, no, that actually was super good. There was actually a lot of relatability to what you shared too, because I ended up like falling into DevRel as like I'm as I call it, because
hmm
I had taught like 300 women to code through a organization called Girl Develop It, and I fell
yeah,
into that because I came to be a TA for like an HTML class, and I was like, "Oh, this is one area I'm pretty good at." And at the time, like I was a pretty proficient developer, but I was like, I just want to get involved so I can learn more. Also, ended up being a TA, and then they're like, "Hey, you should start teaching classes," and I was like, I'm not a teacher. Like, there's no way. And then I started doing it because I had so much fun TAing, and I was like, oh, maybe I like being a teacher. Maybe there's something here.
yeah,
So I agree with you on the education thing. I think there's like a deeply rooted desire to want to empower your peers, right? And so
hmm
that's like how I
hmm
feel like I explain DevRel is like DevRel is the idea. Man, I have a good little one liner for it, but it's like DevRel is the idea of supporting other developers to successfully
yeah,
build with your product, right? It's like
yeah,
that's it in its essence. And so I think when you have that mentality, right, of like wanting to help other developers, whether that be stepping away from your own code and having a face-to-face conversation or writing a tutorial or what have you, like then I think you're absolutely right, because also we see that in like open source projects, we see that in a lot of developers, right? Like Aaron Francis, he's a prime example of that. Like he
yeah,
loves to educate, but he also real is very technical. Obviously, a very great software engineer, right? And so
hmm
I agree with that. I think I'm curious to see how you think about it, because as I was chatting, I just chatted with someone this morning actually, and hopefully she gets to see this. But we were just talking about sort of the different dynamics of DevRel as well, because I feel like if you do love to code, but you also have just like this little glimmer of desire to help other developers, I feel like falling into like a software engineering role that's focused on developer experience is kind of like that beautiful like little mix, right? Because
yeah.
you're like thinking about it. So I'm curious to like hear how you think about that. But I had kind of broke it out to her of I'm like, if you still want to stay super technical, find a developer experience role. If you really want to be out in front of developers, hanging out with them, just advocating, I think you know where this one's going. Find a
Yeah.
developer advocate role. If you
hmm
really enjoy bringing developers together in a community sense, right? Find a community role. Or if you love all those things, try to find a DevRel role that's sort of that founding DevRel, or maybe
Yeah.
just a one that has a little bit of mix of all the things.
Yeah.
But I'm curious if, I mean, is there anything that you feel like maybe I miss? Like, how do you look at that in terms of helping them sort of find their way in DevRel?
No, I actually think it like you kind of like covered everything on at least the way I see it. And your point on working with DX is like I actually have an example of like someone who used to work with me, and he was really really good in DevRel, but he always missed a little bit of the whole like I just want to be closer to engineering, like I just want to be
Mm,
closer to like I'm doing DevRel and it's great. Like I'm happy to kind of like create all the demos and everything, but I really want to be closer to engineering.
hmm
And what he ended up doing was he actually moved into the DX team, and it was great because now we almost had an ally on the DX team. Like we had this person who kind
Amazing.
of like moved from DevRel into the DX team. So and it's not that we didn't work with the DX team before, but it just became so much easier because
Yep.
now we have someone who's kind of like been on the trenches. They've seen and heard everything. They've had the feedback and they understand. So that was like it was almost like this kind of like beautiful transition, which
hmm
I don't know that a lot of people in DevRel actually end up making this kind of transition into like DX, or I know some people who moved from DevRel into product or like product into DevRel. Um, but it's kind of nice when like it's nice to see this happening,
Hmm.
because now like that person just brings like an entire new perspective into like whatever team they go to.
Yep.
So yeah, I really like that, and I very much agree. Like, if your thing is like more of a hardcore like developer, like a hardcore software engineer, then maybe like DX is kind of like the way to go, because you still love the educational sides of it. You still love the kind of like the develop, like looking and improving developer experience, but you wanna do that with your own hands. Like you wanna go and make that difference yourself. I feel like that's a good way to do it.
Yeah, I agree. Well, you brought up a good point too of like, okay, reporting structures, right? We've talked about
Yeah.
those, I think, already. But you had just shared like DX being outside of DevRel, and I've seen both, right? I've seen it inside of DevRel, I've seen it outside of DevRel.
Hmm.
Curious to sort of like maybe talk back and forth, right? Of like where DX lives, because I think that that is sometimes like, is that in engineering? Is that in product? Is that over in DevRel? Like, where have you seen that being placed?
um I have seen DX being placed under, like, it's again, it's super subjective, because like where you go kind of like dictates how that goes. So I have
Very
seen
true.
DX being under DevRel. I've also seen Docs being under DevRel, and I think it kind of like works well. But I've seen Docs being under products. I've seen Docs being under engineering, and
Hmm.
I guess the same for DX. Like I've seen DX in product and engineering, and I look, I have one opinion here for DevRel. I don't really have an opinion for DX or Docs, but I do think DevRel sits under marketing.
Mm.
And the reason I think it sits under marketing is, whenever I've seen DevRel sitting under anything else, they're basically too biased to do one thing that is not necessarily good for the developers that they're serving.
Ooh, tell me more. What's like an
Okay,
example of
so
that?
one example is when I see DevRel working under product, and I have seen that in a few places. So when I see DevRel working on the product, most times what happens is DevRel are trying to push product's agenda, but they're
Mm.
not necessarily working on they're not necessarily doing the back and forth of like,
Oh.
okay, so um, we're going to talk to you about this product, but we also want your feedback. So it's almost like it almost becomes a one-way conversation rather than being like a two-way conversation.
Mm.
And
Interesting.
when I've seen DevRel under engineering, so like, there are like lots of, like, Google is one that comes to mind where DevRel is under engineering.
Mhm.
I think what ends up happening is, um, DevRel people, they become like too much of an engineer that they don't have time to actually do some DevReling. Like they don't have time
Mm.
to do a lot of the and the thing about like DevRel being under engineering is like it's interesting because like they're really close to the products, like they're really close to like what's going on to the minutes, which sounds very interesting, but in most cases they become like too much of an engineer to be
Mm.
able to do DevRel.
Mhm.
And when you become too much of an engineer to be able to do DevRel, what happens is you don't you're almost like too biased towards the thing that you're building right now. So if
Yeah.
someone comes to you and says, "Hey, I don't think this is very good," you almost have this answer really quickly, as in like, "No, we're doing this because of that," and it's like, yeah, that's not how
Mm.
you should be doing DevRel.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's like whenever I get asked this question, like where should it sit, and it's like, look, I feel like DevRel needs to exist. So if you tell me that you're not gonna have DevRel because the only place you can put DevRel is like under product, put it under product. Okay, like it needs to exist. But for me, like in the ideal world, it feels like the only place where DevRel is not necessarily too biased is under marketing, as long as you have an experienced DevRel kind of like leading the charge.
Yeah. I think that part, the last thing that you said, I think is super, super important to that.
It makes all the difference. Yeah.
It does, because when you also think about it, so like it is very interesting that you think that, because honestly, like people have asked my opinion and I'm like, oh, like I get kind of like I have many opinions, right? And so like at the end of the day, at the end of the day, it like comes back to like what's the objectives of the team, right? Why are you
Sure.
bringing DevRel
Yeah.
in? And so
Yeah.
that's kind of how I look at it. And it's like if the purpose is for growth, right, then like, yeah, it probably makes sense to be under marketing. But then at the same time, when you are under a marketing team, man, you just feel like an outsider, you know? You
It's
feel
true.
like you're
Yeah.
someone very technical and they're talking in funnels and attribution and
Hmm.
all these other things, and their goals are so much different than the goals that you know as a traditional software engineer. And, again, speaking to experience, right? If you're experienced, hopefully you understand that
Yeah.
you have shifted worlds. But I do think that marketing has the money, and so sometimes that can be valuable because the budget is right there. Oddly enough, I'm trying to think. So at Snap, I reported to partnerships, like so essentially the
Okay.
sales team. And I
Yeah.
think that folks are just like, oh, sales. But you know how I feel about sales, right? Like, I think
Yeah.
DevRel is sales. I'm not saying
Hmm.
traditional sales, but I think the end result leads to sales, it leads to
Yeah.
revenue. And I actually think that was pretty beautiful because, but to be honest, our team dynamic was different, right? We were almost like a little startup inside of Snap. And so we had product marketing, product, partner engineering, which was our engineering for our product, and then partnerships. And I don't think there's anyone else. And we all just worked together really, really, really closely. Like all of us
Okay.
worked really closely. So I think it worked better in that way because I was actually closer to the people who are going to be using the product, right? As partnerships, I was having the conversations of what are your pains? What do you need to gain? What is it that you're trying to do? And be
Hmm.
able to bring that to them in that way. But I've been under customer success, which I thought was also really meaningful because at that company, it was very much about enablement, right? And being able
Yeah.
to find that success. So I think that's interesting. So when you think about it reporting to marketing, then is that where you see the DX team being outside of DevRel?
That's where I see it being outside. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think, if you have a what is essentially a small engineering team sitting on the marketing, it just becomes too confusing. Okay.
Hmm.
I forgot to say there's another way to look at it as well. And I've seen this before, but I've never really experienced this myself, which is like DevRel just being its own thing.
Hmm.
Okay. And I've seen some companies do this where, they have a C level in DevRel, and DevRel is its own thing. Like it's not under marketing, it's not under anything. It's like there's a DevRel pillar.
Hmm.
Um, Again, I can't really speak for like how effective that is. And also, again, like I think if you're in that situation, then you need someone at that C level to really behave like a C level person and really make sure that they will represent DevRel correctly,
Hmm.
um, to the same level where, like, in a marketing team, you're going to have a CMO, for example. So, like, you need someone who's going to represent that way. Again, I can't speak for like how well that works, but I've seen that happening as well. And
Yeah.
I know some people advocate for this as well. Like some people say, well, yeah, that's the best way to go. Um, but whenever you ask for like real life examples of teams that still exist doing this, I can't think of one. So
Yeah. It's kind of interesting to think about that because, like, the way that I see DevRel and its roots, right? I'm kind of like, just put us wherever you're going to put us, right? Because it's just at the end of the day, you don't really get a lot of control on top of it. You come into a team or you come into it and it's already where it is. But I think that like my comparison is like I see DevRel like HR, right? Of like, and I don't see it like HR in its fundamentals, but I see it
mhm.
in HR in that like every company needs HR, whether it's a fractional, whether it's contract, whether it's
Yeah.
whatever. It's an
Mhm.
integral part of, and I see it as HR for developer targeted products, of course. Not every company needs a DevRel, but I see
Yep.
it as an HR is like that function that like works internally with all of the teams, right? Every single organization, every single facet of the company, two, for the greater good of the company, right? So it's like we need to bring in the right people. And I see that DevRel being not the only being internal, but I see it like that type of a function, right?
Yeah.
engineering can benefit from it, especially if you don't have an engineering blog, if you're not talking, if you're not actually outward about your engineering, what you're doing. I think also from a recruiting standpoint for engineering, right? It's like we know the talent, we're out there talking to them.
Yeah.
Product, absolutely, that's a given. Marketing, given, right? Customer success, it's a given. There's just so many different things that it can impact. And I almost feel like it's more like HR. And so then it's like, HR doesn't have its own function. It doesn't have an executive suite. Sometimes maybe it's like inside of operations, and maybe operations as a
Hmm.
whole, has HR,
Yeah.
but I don't often see HR sitting in the C-suite. And so I just feel like similar to HR, I think it has a similar dynamic of impacting the entire organization for the most part.
Yeah.
But
I agree.
sitting within one function because it has to exist somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. And it's funny you say this because I like that analogy is great. Like I'm probably gonna steal that's like the whole like
Steal
DevRel
it
and,
away.
and like yeah DevRel and being like HR. Um, I think it's a good analogy because look when you're interviewing with a company and you're like on the very early stages of the interview and say maybe the first conversation you had was like with someone from product, you can very quickly tell whether this company has an HR department or not, or that person.
Yep.
And funnily enough, I feel like whenever I interact with a company as a developer, I can very quickly tell whether that company has DevRel or not.
Yep.
Okay,
I agree.
and and it's like it's not like because I didn't talk to someone from HR or because I didn't talk to someone from DevRel. It's just because of the way it feels.
Yep.
Like it's just
Exactly.
because of like how messy certain things feel and how kind of like not really well thought through some things feel. So like I like the analogy because of this because um, I don't know that I can tell whether a company has a CMO, for example. Like
Yeah.
I don't know that I can tell whether like look, maybe I don't even know that I can tell whether a company has someone in sales because maybe they have a CEO who's like really like a really strong seller and like I'm gonna talk to said CEO and they'll sell me something. Um, but I can definitely tell when I talk to a company and they or like when I interact with a company and they don't have DevRel.
Hmm.
Like it's so easy to tell. So
That's a good comparison to the analogy because it's so true, right? You go into a company, if they don't have HR, you can tell that there's, I don't mean this in a mean way, but you can tell that if there is any toxic behavior, it's not being addressed, right? And you can just kind of
yeah,
feel that, like, the lack of sort of coordination and like operational excellence there, right? And like you
yeah,
said, I honestly feel like, and most developers, I really feel like can land on a product page and have a good estimate of A, does this founder deeply understand developers, or B, do they have DevRel? If they have
yeah.
sales, if they have sales demo buttons all over the place, they don't know what's going on. They don't
They
have
don't know what's
DevRel.
going on. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that even more.
Yeah,
Amazing.
and I also, and this is something I started to pay attention because, and maybe today we kind of like get to talk about this as well. Um, you can also tell when a company had DevRel but doesn't have it anymore. Like
Mhm.
you can tell how certain things change. You can tell how the attention to detail to certain things kind of like just like go fades a little bit, like it just goes away a little
Mhm.
bit. So yeah, you can definitely like whenever I because like sometimes I have conversations right now like through my company. I have conversations with companies who had DevRel, then didn't have DevRel, and then they're looking to kind of like just start a new DevRel program again. And in a lot of cases, and it's kind of like why I decided to do this. Um, in a lot of cases, companies they have this realization of like, okay, we need DevRel. Then they hire someone, but they don't necessarily hire someone like they don't necessarily set this person up for success. I'm not even saying I'm not even talking about being the right or wrong candidate, but they don't
Mhm.
necessarily set this person up for success. And then 3 months go by, and then everyone is just frustrated because like things aren't working the way they expect. Um, and then you can, eventually these companies they go and they kill the program. like a lot, we've seen a lot of companies do this before. So they kill the program, and then a few months later, maybe a couple of years later, they decide to kind of like bring it back. And then what I do is I always like to do a bit of like some research on like what's this company been through, and also like what does it mean for me to go and work with this company, like what
Mhm.
have they done in the past, because like if I see anything that I don't like, I will most likely not gonna want to work with this company. Okay, like I
Mhm.
will. um and it's funny because like as you start to kind of like just go through this timeline, you go, oh, okay, so I bet it was April when they when they cut DevRel, and then you see everything that comes after this, and then and you see what they're trying to get back. So
Yep.
yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah. Okay, so I think you brought up a really valuable topic because I think that that is such a common question. And I'm sure your clients have this constantly. People that I talk to have it constantly of like, how do you set somebody up for success in DevRel? And I think this is a very wide and massive topic. So I think we should dive into it if you're open to it.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, what are your thoughts?
I wrote a blog post on this pretty early on when I started my business.
Hmm.
And essentially, my thoughts were if you could write a strategic vision for DevRel on what you're objectively looking for and the efforts at which your DevRel would contribute to, then you could be potentially ready. Obviously, there's a
Yeah.
lot of other dynamics that fall into that. But I think, we can keep chatting about this, obviously, and go back and forth. But I think that during COVID, right, we saw an uptick of a lot of DevRel programs, a lot of DevRel functions, a lot more investment from DevRel, which was amazing. But I think that's also, and you and I have talked about this in our check ins before, there was also a lot of people who were set up for failure, honestly. Like they
Hmm.
were brought into roles, maybe they were engineers before and they never done DevRel and they were founding engineer and
Yep.
they just like started wearing all the hats of what they thought DevRel was like, right? Like going out and public speaking and being on socials and writing content and doing the things. And then they
Yep.
weren't necessarily seeing the results, right? The founders didn't see the results. The DevRel person is like, what are you talking about? I've reached all these developers. Speaking
Exactly.
to
Yeah.
your LinkedIn post that I just saw, which LinkedIn's algorithm is crazy. It could be 2 weeks old, but you actually had a post that reach does not equal impact.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
agree with that, right? And that I think when it comes down to that, right, I think they have to be set up to understand what's expected of them because on top of like DevRel, right, there's just all these different things that they can do. And without clarification and guidance of like, no, we're going to chase down this approach, right? This campaign, this idea of getting this new product feature out there, and we're going to do it in these different ways. And these are the objectives and the metrics that we're tracking. Without that clarity, you're just putting somebody up for failure, honestly,
Yeah.
because they're going to try all the things and likely not necessarily stick to what they're doing. So this almost comes back to the first part of our conversation of like, do you love writing code and sticking to, I know exactly what I'm working on. I know exactly when I'm done.
Yeah.
I know
Hmm.
exactly what I've contributed. I can see my influence through my pull requests or through my contributions. Where in DevRel, it's like, it's a whole lot of nothing. It's a whole lot of not knowing
Yeah.
in
It's true.
some cases when you're
Yeah.
just trying to chase after the reach without the strategy behind it.
And that's where I think most founders, and I say most founders, and it really is like in my opinion, like most founders go wrong when they decide to start with DevRel, because there's a whole bunch of expectations, and there's a whole bunch of expectations that may or may not be something in the DevRel realms. And then they end up hiring someone who doesn't really have the experience to kind of like fulfill those expectations, or someone who doesn't even know that they need to fulfill those expectations. Okay.
Exactly that.
And I'm not gonna say like I'll make a comparison here, but like I'm not gonna say that one is easier than the other. um, but I do feel like as a if I were a founder and I found and I hired someone to do sales for me, my expectation is that this person sells my product.
Hmm.
Um, the person that I hired to do sales for me, their understanding is that they're coming in to sell said product. Okay,
Yep.
so it's a very kind of like in a way, it's very easy to make an assumption here that this partnership is going to work.
Mhm.
Okay. Whereas I think when it comes to DevRel, um, what most founders do is they really need someone to do marketing for them because they haven't done it. Okay. And then they hire someone to do DevRel because someone said DevRel is cool. And now they have this expectation of DevRel of doing all these things. And I say, when I say all these things, I mean, you know, you need to go out to events. You need to make sure that our docs are good. You need to make sure that we have videos. You need to make sure. So it's all the kind of like hats. Like, you know, you need to make sure that you wear all these hats and you're basically backfilling for like maybe two, three, or more marketing people who could be doing this. Oh, also, you need to make sure that you look after our socials, look
Oh,
after our
yeah.
Twitter, look at, and also make sure that you look after our Discord. Also, make sure that you answer questions on Discord. So suddenly you have like this one person whose expectations is to kind of like do everything. Okay,
Mhm.
and this one person, like what we must not forget is this one person comes in, and as soon as they're out to go to an event, everything else stays behind. So like, you know,
Yep.
they're not looking on Discord, they're not doing socials, or like maybe they're tweeting from a conference or something, but like they're not doing socials, they're not creating content, they're not doing video. Um, and I think, you know, this person is out at an event and they feel like I'm doing my job, like I'm doing events, like it's one of the things I should be doing on my job. But
Yep.
then also they come back and this founder goes to them, okay, so what is the ROI on the event? And it's like, I mean, I talk to 11 people, or I talk to 100 people, or like, you know, what is like what is 100 people in terms of like selling my products, or in terms. So it's just like the wrong expectations. I feel like you know, founders go about it the wrong way because they have the wrong expectations, and a lot of especially inexperienced DevRels, they will kind of like fall into this hole of I am just gonna do everything my founder or like, you know, my manager asked me to do,
Mhm.
and that is when DevRel fails, and that, you know, that's kind of like when it's almost, I almost feel like it benefits me at one point because those founders will reach out to me like 6 months later saying, hey, can you actually help us do this right? Because like we tried before and
Yep.
it didn't work. Okay. So in a way, it's like, okay, so I see this whole thing going on and it benefits me in 6 months. But the reality is like, I hate seeing people fail. Okay. Like
Yes.
I hate seeing like DevRel fail. I hate seeing DevRel saying, I don't ever want to go to events ever again, or like I don't ever want to be DevRel ever again.
Yes.
And it just hurts when I see like people going through this because like the other thing about being DevRel for any company, which I, you know, hopefully like most people feel this way, is like that company becomes part of your life.
Mhm.
Okay, it's like, you know, you're like you're advocating for a company, so you must kind of like have some feelings for that company. So that company kind of like becomes part of your life, and like ultimately when you work for a company for 6 months and it doesn't work, it's like, okay, so I just wasted 6 months of my life working for that company, and now I feel pretty hurt
Mhm.
because they just like fired me,
Yeah.
or so yeah.
But you think you're doing good because you're wearing all the hats, right? You're doing all the things, you're
Absolutely.
wearing all the
Yeah.
hats, like, the founder keeps pushing these different things, like, "This is what I
Yeah.
think DevRel is," right? And so then you get fired and you just don't even understand what you did wrong, right? And you
Yeah.
feel so
Yeah.
demotivated.
Hmm.
The thing that you said about, like, never wanting to do DevRel again, that really hits me too, because it's like, I do really think that DevRel is a beautiful thing if it's something that you're interested in, right? If you're interested in, like you said, the education and the other stuff, like,
Yeah.
I think it's such a fulfilling opportunity because you get to help your peers and it just feels so good to do that. At least that's how I feel about it.
Hmm.
And so it also equally makes me incredibly sad when they step away and feel that way. Like, I'm never doing DevRel again. And I talked to a lot of people during the COVID and kind of 2020, 2021, and 2022 timeframe where they're like, I'm never doing DevRel again. And I'm sure there's a couple in my network. There's some that I'm sure might even be watching this, right? Of I'm never doing DevRel again. And I think it's hurtful. But I think it's
Yeah.
interesting because when you take a step back and you think about that, right? Like all the hats, social media, events, tutorials, documentation, answering community tickets. Like what? Now we've got marketing, customer success, product engineering,
Yeah.
recruiting, maybe a little bit. Like In what
Yeah.
world would we ever expect that someone can come in and do all those functions and do those jobs? Like we would never, ever, ever, ever expect one person to do all those jobs unless you're a very early stage startup and you were
Sure.
bringing in someone in on the founding team and they agreed to
Hmm.
that and they're like, great, I'll take operations and marketing and a couple other things, right? But they're an
Yeah.
executive and the equity is fat and the opportunity is amazing, right? But we're supposed to, as DevRel, come into that type of an environment and just wear all the hats and do all the things.
Yeah. And in a way, it's like it's almost like, why are you complaining? That's your job. Like
Yes.
that's kind of like
Yes.
the way, that's the way it kind of like, it comes across. Like, why are you complaining that you're doing 16 things in an hour? Like that's your job. And it's like, no, 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 it's not. But then
Hmm.
again, it's like the flip side of it is, if it's not clearly defined what the job is, okay, and I feel like, from a maybe from a candidate's perspective, like when folks are applying to things, like make sure you understand like what the job is, like make sure you understand like that it is like clearly, like your job is clearly defined. Like, I feel like, again, like going back to the example of sales, like when you're hired to like do sales, sales is your job, okay, like
Yep.
you're not doing marketing, like, you're doing
Nope.
sales. And I think, if folks are applying for like DevRel jobs and like their jobs aren't clearly defined, I'll say in most cases, like they will suffer because of this. And I've seen a lot of people suffer because of this,
Yep.
just because there's this kind of like unfunded expectation of like, well, you're just gonna do everything that I don't have a team for,
Yeah.
okay.
Yes.
um, and yeah, so I not very long ago, I actually heard, and hopefully he's not listening, but I heard a founder saying this, like, I knew I had to go and hire marketing, but I decided to hire more DevRel, and I was like, why? No, you need to go hire marketing. Like, don't hire DevRel. Like, that's, like, you should have DevRel, but also you should have marketing, and also you should have sales, and also, like, and also you should have someone who looks after your socials, and maybe, um, you know, two people can kind of like share one job while you go hire, but like, don't hire DevRel to kind of like fulfill everything else within your company,
Yep.
because that's not going to happen. And then, you're going to end up frustrated because you come with an expectation, and and that expectation isn't going to be met. The person you hired will probably end up quitting, because they'll be like, they'll feel terrible about their jobs. So like, don't go hiring DevRel just because you want to hire somebody in marketing. Like, that's not it. That's not how
Yep.
you do it.
I fully agree. I think that I don't know if we talked about this last time or not, but I feel like as a conversation that came up like recently with someone, and I think that the best opportunity for DevRel is to be able to come in. Those functions are in place. They have stakeholders that believe in
Yeah.
DevRel. They understand the power of DevRel while also understanding the limitations of a human, and are able to be like that glue, right? The DevRel can be the glue between all
Yeah.
those different functions, and it's like you're going to bring developers together as a DevRel. We're going to know what developers want from an event, say, right? Like if we're going to bring a meetup together, we're going to know what they're going to want to do, how they're going to want to operate,
Hmm.
what that may, when, where, all the things, right? But then that's kind of where it ends. Here's the strategy for my event. Here you go, marketing. You've got the budget, you've got the
Yeah.
logistics, you've got the people
Yeah.
that can go and make all this happen, right? You know how to track it best. I'm not saying we don't want to track things in DevRel. You absolutely want to track things, but in a different way, right? The way that I would track things as an event is I would actually track the meaningful conversations. What came out of that? Did it lead to a partnership? Did it lead to another thing? Did it lead to another opportunity to speak or create content? And then where did that lead to, right? Where marketing can care about registrations, who showed up, what
Yeah.
that led to, right? The metrics that actually matter for marketing, right? And then
Hmm.
DevRel can care about what they need to care about. And so I fully agree. And I think it feels to me like where this conversation is leading to is like a lack of definition on DevRel, which I
Yeah.
think many of us in the industry have really tried to do our due diligence or do our best job to try to define DevRel. But I think even at the end of the day, it's still hard to define in some ways. But coming back to like your project, right? It's like, it's just that thing of like, there is a framework, there's a science, there's a method to the madness that I don't know how or why it isn't being picked up on. Maybe we're not doing a good enough job. I don't know.
I mean, look, when you look at different roles out there, like you talk about a, let me just think about something that took me a while to understand. Um,
Mm.
so when you talk about something like PMMs, for example, like a PMM's job is basically to work on the messaging for a product. Like, what is your go-to market plan going to be, and like what is the messaging?
Hmm.
Um, I feel like PMMs kind of like fall into the same trap,
Mm.
just
Agree.
because their jobs are very open-ended. They can be doing multiple things. Like, I had situations where like I took PMM to events with me, for example,
Yep.
even though like it's not necessarily what they do, but they helped with the messaging. They helped with like, what is this booth going to look like?
Hmm.
Also, they have they usually have really strong understanding on the product,
Yep.
because like they're creating message for that product. But the reality is like when you work at a company where like there's PMM, you will always see that there's misconceptions about what PMMs do. There is abuse on like asking PMMs to do things that is not necessarily their jobs. So what I'm trying to say is, I guess the reason for this is because a PMM will thrive a lot more in an organization that is like more well structured.
Hmm.
And I think DevRel is in a similar boat. Okay. I find it really hard for DevRel to do well on a three-person business. Okay, like on a
Mm.
kind of like
Hmm.
on a like if your startup is like too small, I find it really hard for this kind of like founding DevRels to kind of like do well and thrive, because ultimately what will happen is like their the scope of their job is so wide that they will end up being abused. Okay,
Yep.
and I say abused in like speech marks because it's not necessarily on purpose,
Yeah.
but like when you're working for like a small organization, well, maybe you're gonna have to kind of like dive into the production codes and fix a bug. Okay, like this is not DevRel's job. Like DevRel's like they're developers, but they're not necessarily the people who do engineering, or like they're not necessarily the people who go and like fix a Docker container or something. Okay, but in some cases, like they'll end up doing this. And again, it
Hmm.
kind of goes back to something that we talked about last week, which is most people are DevRel because they like helping,
Yep.
and they will just say yes to like pretty much anything and everything. Okay,
Hmm.
and again, like when you open up that kind of precedent, then yeah, suddenly you're now a DevRel, an engineer, a solutions engineer, a salesperson, and if there's someone coming to the office for a visit, you also make coffee. Okay, and it's like you're kind of just doing all these things. um and so I think it's more to do with like structure. Okay,
Yeah.
because i I don't feel like I ever struggle to explain DevRel in kind of like bigger, more like structured organizations. Like, there's
Hmm.
always going to be the odd one who says, like, what is DevRel? And then you explain, they go like, oh, okay, yeah, I get it.
Yep.
But when you're like in a kind of like smaller environment, then I guess the work just becomes a little more diluted.
Yep.
Okay. And I'm not trying to advocate for like smaller companies to not have DevRel. But what I will say is like, if your company is like a 5-person company, then maybe DevRel is not what you need. Okay, like maybe you need someone who's like a growth marketer. Maybe
Yeah.
you need someone who's going to help you out with like your your campaigns. Like, you've gone past like you've gone past PMF, and now you just need some help with like creating Google ads or something. Like, you're kind of like, going to the next level, but like DevRel is not it.
Mhm. I agree. I agree. Well, I think have you read Adam Frankel's book? It's like something
What
about
is
like it's like I have it somewhere. I don't
I'm
think I have it
terrible
next
with
to my
like
desk.
author names, like, but
So
I'll
it's
remember
something
the
of
book.
it's like the developer facing startup. I remember that part, but I don't remember the first two words. If it's just called the developer facing startup, I can't remember. But I
Okay.
think that book is really really good for founders to pick up who are considering DevRel because he doesn't necessarily even about DevRel, but he talks about the evolution of a developer facing product or a startup, right? And like
Right.
how you need to actually invest in as the CEO, you should be doing early sales, you should be doing early marketing so that you understand the different dynamics, the functions within your company, and then start to slowly bring in other resources, right? And I just think that that's
Yeah.
really powerful to think about too, is if you're going to bring someone in to do those things, what do those things look like for you? Like, what do you think is going to drive success? And I know that there's
hmm
probably some founders that are like, I don't know what's going to drive success. And that's the whole reason that I'm hiring DevRel to begin with. And I get that. I understand that growth of developers is not an easy thing to be able to, like wrangle in. But I think at the same time, like that sort of trial and error, as you're saying, right, before you find that product market fit and everything has, I don't want to say everything, but you have clarity on things and the direction at which you're going, that's the
Yeah.
time to kind of experiment, right? And to understand like what could DevRel look like for our team should we bring that in.
Yeah. I agree with that. And and I also like, I have to say though, like I actually really appreciate when I talk to early stage companies and they go like, we are focused on developers. So like we need help with like, how we talk to developers, what our messaging is and everything.
Absolutely.
And again, like I I'm not gonna say this one for my benefits here, but I think maybe if you're like that early and you need some help with the messaging, because again, you're starting to get in front of developers and like, they will appreciate a good message as much as they will hate a terrible message. Okay, so it's kind of like but I will say at that stage, maybe what you need is not DevRel. Maybe what you need is just like someone to help you out with those
Mm-hmm.
things. Okay. Maybe what you need is like, you need a few hours with Marcus or you need a few hours with Tessa to kind of like just figure out what that is. Then, here are the 10 things that you need to do, founder. Go do those things. And but you don't necessarily need to go and hire a DevRel right at that moment. Okay.
Nice.
And because like I have a lot of appreciation for founders in general, because like getting started is really hard. Okay, because like you basically suddenly you have a business and everything just kind of like revolves around you, and like you're doing all the things. You're kind of like, until you have someone doing payroll, you're doing payroll, and until you have someone kind of like, doing your websites, like you're doing your website, you're doing kind of like everything. So like I have a lot of appreciation for founders in this, because like, look, they're building a business. Okay, like they don't have a lot of time to do a bunch of other things. um but I also think like, it's sometimes it's almost like too early to hire someone.
Mm-hmm.
um and like, if you're, look, if you're a three-person business, you're probably not going to hire a CFO.
Yep.
Like you're probably not at a stage, and I'm not trying to compare DevRel with the CFO,
For
but
sure.
like, there are different stages in which like it becomes like more natural for you to hire that person, and also that person will have an environment where they can thrive. And I feel like it's the same with with a CFO. Okay, like, if you have no kind of like money going around, if you don't have any numbers going around, then a CFO is not really going to have much to do. And it's the same with DevRel.
I'm so glad that you said that because I kind of pitched that up in a way for you to be able to kind of swoop in and share some of what you do in that way, right? Because that is the time for them to find a fractional DevRel, or I don't even want to say that it's necessarily fractional DevRel, but just someone who can be that consultant, who can be that guidance. It's like
Yeah,
finding an advisor or someone that you can bring on that can just be that sort of sounding board for what is it that you need? How do you drive growth with the developers? How do you get started and set them up for success, right? And I know you and
yeah,
I have talked about this many times of like how you go in and you've already shared, right? Sometimes where it's like they had DevRel and they got rid of it and now they want DevRel again. And it's like you come in and you sort of lay that groundwork, right? So that when they do bring in DevRel, that they are ready for DevRel. They can
yeah.
hit the ground running with success. They know exactly what the expectations are for DevRel, and that
Hmm.
person can find success and happiness in their role because all of that foundation has been laid.
Yeah, yeah. And honestly, I feel like the sort of like this partnership can be a really happy partnership. Like I've seen
Hmm.
a lot of early-ish stage startups, and I say early-ish, like I'm probably saying like series B or something, maybe like late series A startup. Like I've seen a lot of like really good happy stories of like founders who go and they find DevRel, and then they see kind of like this entire different path where developers can come in, they have a good, like, it's possible. But I
Hmm.
think you just need to, as a founder, like you just need to make sure that you're laying the groundwork yourself, or you're
Yep.
hiring someone to kind of like do that for you. So when you find someone, that person is going to come and they will be amazing at their job, they'll have everything they need, and everyone's going to be happy. So like it's very possible, but I feel like a lot of people just go about it the wrong way. Okay,
Hmm.
kind of like, again, kind of like going back to my CFO example, like a lot of people just go and hire a CFO on day two when a company starts trading, and it's like, well, that's not gonna, the CFO is gonna be unhappy, you're gonna be unhappy, and like it's not gonna bring any benefits.
Yep. Yep. I completely agree. Which I think speaks to sort of the origination of kind of what we were talking about, right? Is like, why does DevRel fail? And there's obviously a number of things that go into that. And then how do you set them up for success? And I think bringing an expert in that can either create that strategy alongside of you,
Yeah,
understanding what the objectives are of your company, or you're bringing someone in at that level. But to bring someone in at that level, right, you have to have some funding because it's not necessarily a cheap hire if they have experience and they have the
no,
knowledge and they have the expertise. So, yeah.
yeah, yeah. And what you don't want is, like, you don't want to, as a founder, like, you don't want to get to a point where you're trying to like justify things, or worse, you're trying to make sure that person justifies like why is it that they have a salary.
Yep.
Okay, like, I'm paying a six-figure salary to this individual, and like I'm not seeing the results, or like, I need them to show me the results. And it's like, yes, but if you don't help them help you, then it's just really hard.
Yeah.
And
What
I feel
results
like
do you
that's the,
want?
yeah, exactly, like I feel like that's the, it is the biggest mistake. And again, like it kind of goes back to the whole, you know murkiness of the metrics of DevRel.
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
because again, I have my own ideas of like what good metrics are for DevRel, but again, like, these are very specific and subjective to like what I do. And every single time I start like a new engagement with the company, I kind of like take a step back from like my own preconception, and I just go, okay, tell me about what you care about. And
Mhm.
like, tell me, founder, or like whoever it is that I'm dealing with, like, tell me about what are the things that you want. And I know the first thing you're going to say is growth. Everyone wants growth, like everyone wants more followers, everyone wants more signups, and um, but I just need to go down to the details of like what it is that you want.
Yep.
Because it may be that as a founder, you're going to be really stoked if I create some content and we end up in Hacker News and suddenly the website's down because, like, there's so much traffic. Or maybe you're going to get really upset because only 5% of that traffic converted, or maybe none of that traffic converted. And so it's really important to kind of like almost set these ground rules from the beginning, as in like, what do you care about, and how can I make that happen for you?
Mhm.
And then, like kind of like going a little further on the metrics. And this one is funny, Tessa, because I feel like I have that conversation, especially with DevRel people. Like whenever I consult with people who work in DevRel, like they work in the space, and like, they need some help. I always ask about, what are your tools, like like how do you look at metrics, or how do you look at, your numbers?
Mhm.
And it's kind of surprising that a lot of people don't really have an answer to this.
Mhm.
Okay. And the answer that I want people to say, I look in PostHog, or I look in Mixpanel, or I look in, like, Google Analytics. Okay, but like I look somewhere. um but it's kind of surprising that, like, a lot of people just don't. Okay.
Mhm.
And I kind of came to this realization um the other day, and this one, it may sound a little harsh, but like it just feels true. Like every time I talk to someone, it just feels true. um the same people in DevRel who don't track any metrics are the same people getting laid off.
I agree.
I'm not saying that it's like, don't get me wrong. Like, I'm not saying that everyone getting laid off is getting laid off for that reasons.
Yep.
But a lot of the people I spoke with who don't really track any metrics, or their metrics are, oh yeah, we do awareness, like we go to events, and um, they're the same people who end up being laid off.
Yeah. And obviously to caveat that, there a lot of people are getting laid off in like blanket chunks, right? So it's not applicable
Absolutely.
to that type of situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
It's
When
applicable
like,
to
big companies, like, Microsoft has layoffs, it's
yeah.
like it's a bunch of people, and they a lot of the people are like really amazing at their jobs, and they still end up being laid off.
Yep.
um
But
but I
these are the
think a
teams
lot.
we're talking about. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, yeah,
The teams we're talking about where DevRel gets cut, right? And it's just
yeah.
DevRel. And then
Hmm.
they're looking for work and they're frustrated and they think that it's the company's fault and like maybe partially it's the company's fault, but it's
Yeah.
partially their fault, right? And like some of that attribution, right? And I think I truly believe that like that is exactly why I track revenue influenced. And like there
Hmm.
I have gotten so much crap for tracking revenue influenced in a DevRel job. And I'm like, that's fine, but I've never been laid off due to lack of performance. And so
Yep.
I think that there's something there, right? And I'm not saying, hey, oh, I'm so great. I'm saying I know that I can easily get cut. My function costs money. It is a cost center at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And so if I'm not turning around and saying, well, look, there's costs here, but there's an ROI, right? For how much you're putting into it, you're getting more out of it. And
Yeah.
I think that's the key part. I think this is also similar to the people who, and again, there's no offense, right? We all are learning and we're all growing. And I didn't know what to track in the beginning, too.
Hmm.
But I think this also speaks to the people who are tracking views and eyeballs and,
Yeah. Yeah.
general reach, just like your LinkedIn post, right? Of like reach does not equal impact. And it's like
Yeah.
you can't come back and say, oh, my blog post got 100 views, or that's actually not a great commentary, but like whatever it is, maybe my blog post got 5,000 views and you're
Yeah.
super
But it's
proud
but
because
it's
it's
also like,
really
what does that mean?
exactly,
Like, my
exactly.
my blog has 100 views, or my blog has 1,000 views, or my blog has 100,000. Like, what does that actually mean? Okay.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like, going back to your point, when you're tracking revenue, it's like everyone understands revenue. Like
Everyone
anyone in your
understands it.
company, like, you could be talking to the CEO, to the CFO, to the CMO, anyone in your company, you talk about revenue, they get it.
Yes,
Okay. Whereas like
exactly.
you talk about blog views, um
What does
what
that
does that,
mean?
yeah, yeah, what does that do? Like, is 100 good? Like, if you're super excited and you say, my blog got 100 views, like, is that good?
Yeah.
Why is that good?
Was there a
A
CTA?
thousand,
Did
so
they click
exactly.
the CTA? Did they sign
Yeah.
up for the product? Did they use the new product feature?
Hmm.
Because I also think we can also see, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing. Sometimes writing content for just the sake of writing content is amazing because sometimes it's like, let me just communicate things. But I
Yeah.
think I've also noticed, especially when I brought DevRel folks onto a bigger team, they were like, oh, I'm excited about these views and whatever. And I'd be like, what's your CTA? And they're like, what's a CTA? And I'm like, it's a call
Yeah.
to action. Why are you writing content? What do you want the users to do next? Right? Yes, there is content that we write, documentation and a variety of different things that we write that literally is just that. It is just informative content. But if we're talking about a blog post and you're excited about the views, how many people followed through with the call to action that you had in your blog post? Did they go
Yeah.
sign up? And then eventually revenue influenced.
Yeah, I agree. And again, it's I'm very surprised that a lot of folks I speak with, they don't even have a clue of like,
Mhm.
CTAs, or like they don't. And again, like it's it's this weird thing, like it's this weird conception of like, if we keep on creating content, like the whole, like, if you build, they'll come. Like if you keep on like creating content, people will come, and eventually it's going to be a success. And it's like, yeah, but like, what is success? Like, what is, it's going to be a success, as in like your video on YouTube goes viral, or like your TikTok video goes. But like, what is success? Is
Yep.
success your views? Is success your conversion? Is success your click-through rates? Like, what is success? And I feel like, in a way, folks just measure the one metric that is really easy, which is like views. Well, yeah, it's
Exactly.
views. Like, I just went to Google Analytics, and it said like it had 100,000 views.
Yeah.
And but that doesn't really mean anything.
Mhm.
There's something else on this, which I'll just like put on as a caveat, which is, um and I don't know if it really speaks against my theory, like what I said earlier, which is like, I think DevRel teams should be under marketing. But I'll say anyway. Um, a lot of these terms are marketing terms.
Yep.
Okay, like,
They are.
CTR and CTA, and like, even, you can explain like, CTRs, click through rates, when someone clicks, like, what is your conversion? Like, it's easy to explain, but also I think the one thing to keep in mind is, um, most people who come into DevRel, they don't necessarily come from a marketing background.
Yep.
And that's also something that we are lacking as an industry. Like, we're
Yep.
lacking a little bit of education. Okay, like, I can't be asking for someone in my team to track conversions when like they don't know where to track, like they don't know where to
Exactly.
start. Um and and I feel like, as an industry, like what I've seen out there is that, there's a lot of like marketing speak, and like a lot of DevRel teams actually sitting under marketing. But
Mhm.
you've mentioned that earlier, like there's always this kind of like this sense of separation, like, when you're in DevRel and you sit under marketing, but it doesn't really feel like you're a marketing team. Like, it doesn't really feel
Exactly.
like you know you can work with other folks, but the reality is like, and like, I'll be honest with you, like, it's mostly how I felt in the past. Like, working within marketing teams was, yes, we're under marketing, but we're DevRel.
Yeah.
Like, yes, we reporting to the CMO, but we're DevRel. Like, we're almost kind of like, there's almost this separation, okay, where
Yep.
you, as someone in DevRel, doesn't necessarily understands everything the marketing team does, and the marketing team doesn't necessarily understand what it is DevRel does. Okay. And again, you can argue that if you have like a strong enough leader in kind of like these organizations, they'll make sure that
For
things
sure.
kind of like get mixed up correctly. But the reality is, a lot of DevRel people, especially when they go sit under marketing, they're now being asked about all these marketing things, funnels and top of funnel and mid of, and like, bottoms up, tops up. Like, they're asked, and they're being told all these things, which half they don't really understand, and they're
Mhm.
trying to move a number that they don't really understand. Like, they're trying to move like conversions when they're like, I don't even know how to track this.
Mhm.
And it's a problem with like our space,
Yes.
that I think we need to fix.
I agree. I also think to add on top of that, which like as you were explaining that, it's kind of like I got sort of the like the tingles of like, oh, that's sort of the drawbacks of reporting to marketing, right? Is that you feel like an outsider. You're like you're not like the
Yeah,
rest of the team. So you constantly feel like an outsider. But I think the benefit of that is that you're exposed to the rest of the team. You're a part of that marketing team. So if they get together for an all hands, they get together for an on-site, they get together for whatever, right? You're spending time with that team. And so that gives you the
hmm,
opportunity to learn from them and to understand and also to teach them about what DevRel is.
yeah,
And that is a
yeah,
part of the function. I think just like you were saying about marketing stuff, I feel the same way about sort of just business strategy in general. Understanding what the executive team cares about, understanding what the board cares about, understanding how business operates, understanding how revenue works, understanding cash flow. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff inside of a business. And I'm not saying you have to know all those things, but I think
yeah,
the more that you can expose yourself to understanding both the board and the executive team, what is it that they're seeking and why are they making those decisions, it can make
yeah.
your life a heck of a lot easier. Because if you
True.
don't, then you feel like you're fighting against them. Why is this a company objective? Why would I go after that thing, right? That doesn't make sense. And then I think
Yeah.
to sort of stereotype a little bit, I think that that is again some of the DevRel folks that do struggle a bit with maybe again the layoffs or maybe again the team destruction and sort of the resolute or the dissolution of DevRel because there's just this conflict and it's not malicious, it's not intentional. The
No.
executive
Yeah.
board isn't out to not have DevRel; they want DevRel, and the
Hmm.
DevRel teams aren't against the executive board to a point, right? But they need to understand why. And I think oftentimes that there can be this just this sort of fight between the two of like they don't understand business and not understanding that hey, business is business and this is how things have to work.
Yeah. Very true. Yeah.
I feel like we
Unfortunate,
get
but very true. Yeah.
it is. I feel like we get saltier as the show goes on. This happened last week too. We like ease into it and we're like, oh, let's just tiptoe and nice topics. And towards the end, we're just like all the salt, all
Yeah.
the opinions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm, it's
No, but I
beautiful.
think like yeah, I actually wanted to talk about this today because I think yeah, I think this is good. I am I always have a lot of sympathy for as someone who's like been laid off in the past, like I always have a lot of sympathy for like folks who kind of like go through this.
Mm-hmm.
Um
It's hard.
but I think especially as I don't know if you're seeing this, but like I feel like the market is warming up again.
It is.
Like there's more roles kind of like coming about, and you're seeing more people on LinkedIn saying, "Hey, I just got a job. I just so I feel like
Yep.
it's warming up, which I think is fantastic. But also, as a kind of like a cautionary tale here is hopefully folks are listening to this, and hopefully they're going into their jobs with a different kind of mind, going into their new jobs with a different mindset as to
Yep.
like how they're gonna do it this time. Okay,
I do agree.
because much like I'm seeing the market warming up, but I'm also seeing new startups opening up DevRel positions. So there's like there's the kind of like the ones that we know of, and then there's like new startups opening up positions, and I feel like in both scenarios, like anyone going for DevRel position should make sure that they're thinking about that value. Okay, and that value is it's not just awareness. Like it's not just creating blog posts. Um, it's not just like getting views and if kind of like going back to the very beginning of this conversation of like what makes like should someone in software engineering like go for DevRel? Um, like going back to that, I think DevRel is like it's not an easy job, and I
Mm-hmm.
feel like a lot of people feel like it's gonna be very easy, and I am going to live like a rock star. I'm gonna throw screens
Mm-hmm.
out of the hotel window. I'll travel and I'll be like jet setting, and it's like it is not that. Okay, like
Nope.
it's not. Yes, there's gonna be a lot of traveling. Um, it's definitely not a very glamorous job. There's going to be a lot of like working on weekends. There's going to be a lot of like late night meetings, and and the travel isn't like, I would much rather go on holidays with my family than like travel to any country like through a company,
Yeah,
because like even the travel, like it's not enjoyable. Okay, like
it's
like in
exhausting.
in yeah, like it doesn't have to be terrible, but also like it's not going on holidays. Okay.
Yep,
um and so I hope the kind of like the people kind of getting into this new wave of like DevRel or companies who are hiring DevRel. um I hope they kind of like go with a different mindset. Okay,
yep,
and like the mindset of going to going because I'm gonna travel to events and because I'm gonna create content and create blog posts, like that doesn't exist anymore.
yep.
Like I don't I honestly, again, kind of like speaking on in favor of the founders, like I don't think any founder should accept this.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, like if you're a
It's
founder
not
and you're
valuable.
hiring a yeah, exactly. So if you're a founder and you're hiring a DevRel and like all they want to do is like go to events, it's like no, just find someone else. Okay, like
Yep,
this is not it's not the job. Maybe this was the job like a decade ago,
yep,
when things were different and like when the job just wasn't like very well established. But the reality is like most of the people who were doing the job a decades ago, like doing this, like they're not doing it anymore. Like they're not doing it like this anymore.
yeah,
Okay, like they're
exactly.
doing other jobs, like they're kind of like much more focused on value.
Yep.
So yeah, hopefully folks are kind of like taking this and applying.
I agree. I think one of our future conversations should be around the ROI of events because honestly, at the end of the day, there's a sweet spot for ROI of events. And then
Yeah,
if you're not in that sweet spot, they are absolutely not worth your while to invest in.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. And look, I used to love events. Okay, like I used to. Oh, I went to so many events. Like I used to love going to events. I used to love like sponsoring events. Um, I love the whole like I'll just go and I'll have some really great conversations. I'll just kind of like talk to people. But when you look at events from like an ROI perspective, it's like, yeah, you really need to be careful with it. Like you
Hmm.
really need to kind of like think about like the not just the money that is going towards it, but like when you think about the money as a whole, as in like
Yep.
you're getting on a plane. You're not going to be able to do your job because you're getting on a plane and you're doing this thing. Depending where you're going to, you're going to be super jet lagged. It's going to be a while until you're actually productive. Um, and like think about the money as a whole rather than that sponsorship costs $25,000. Like there's much more.
Exactly. There is so much more. There's a lot of expenses that go into that. Nice to see you, Mike. Um, there's so many expenses that go into that, right? So if you think about sort of like a sponsorship booth, like let's say it's like a $25,000 booth, like that's a kind of common at like a bigger conference and pretty, average, right? Then add your travel, everything that you just said. So
Yeah.
if you go to that event and you don't come back with, let's say it costs you $50,000, there's just a random number to just help with, right?
Hmm.
Let's say it costs you $50,000 to go to that event. Did that lead to partnerships or opportunities that are going to eventually lead to at least $100,000 in revenue? Not usually.
Not usually. And I think the worst thing of all is maybe it does, but you don't know.
It might, but here's the
Yeah.
thing, when it does, I feel like okay, so this is a whole conversation and maybe we should save it for later, but I think that here's when it does, right? And this was an example, and this happened right before I got laid off from Snap, so I was just, like, so devastated because I came back and I'm like, I have contacts, I've got results, I've got all these partnerships now,
Yeah.
and they're like, "Yeah, sorry, you're laid off, so, like, just throw it away," and I'm like, because I've never once had an event so successful because I went into the event, right? And of course I talked to people, I attended sessions, I spoke at a session, did all the kind of DevRel things, talked to the
Hmm.
developers, we had a social event, took a couple developers out to dinner, right? Just kind of all the traditional things. But then outside of that, which I don't see a lot of developers or DevRel people do, is I had meetings. I had partnership meetings. I reached out
Hmm.
to the people that I knew were going to be strategic meetings, just like a sales rep does, and had
Yeah,
conversations about ideas that they had, what they wanted to build in person, face to face, because that's how you drive meaningful conversations, right? So then I met someone who was a part of a massive organization who then connected me to, I don't even know, maybe 10 other additional opportunities. And so
yeah,
I was walking back with about $1 million in deals, hypothetically. We weren't going after revenue then, but I was
yeah,
walking back with all these different partnership opportunities that were going to lead to that level of revenue should we have been there. That, right? That's when an event is worth it. But still,
yeah,
that event in itself, I think our sponsorship was like 100,000, right? It was a big event. So in order to validate those big events, you have to have the right people, the right boots on the ground, the right activities, and you have to track everything. I'm sorry, but if you have a conversation with someone that's meaningful, you need to turn around, take out your phone, take out your doodle pad, and
yeah.
write it all down. You can't just turn
Hmm.
around and be like, hey, new friend, let's chat about something. Let's go to dinner, and then not track all of that activity that happened at that event.
Yeah. But again, that is providing you have the means of tracking it.
Right. Well, we have
And
notepads.
no, 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 I know, yeah. But
I
like
know what you're
the
saying, though.
yeah, so like the whole, and again, like it always baffles me, but like the whole concept of like a multi-touch attribution method, for example, is like a lot of companies don't get it. Like a lot of like big data teams don't get it. Like a lot of like when you go and say, hey, I spoke to that person and I want to make sure that I can tell like what happened until they became a deal. Um,
Mm-hmm.
like a lot of companies don't have the right instrumentation to kind of like track this, but also a lot of like data science teams don't have the means or like the whole story to be able to track this. I think it's beautiful when you can do it,
Oh, for
and
sure.
you know I feel like unfortunately I was never really lucky enough to be in a place where I had all this. Like a lot of the times I was like, yeah, we've got the data, but there are holes. Like there
Yep.
are some gaps, and we can't tell the whole story. So yeah, providing you actually have the kind of like the instrumentation to be able to track this, it's amazing. And but again, it is so uncommon to have it
Yep.
that
No, I
it's something else that you should consider for like going to events. Like if you are going to spend $100,000 on an event plus T&E, like all the travel and accommodation and everything, um, like you need to consider how you're gonna track it.
yes,
And
I do.
because like yes, you may put it all on an iPad, and or you may kind of like but if you don't have a way of like tracking this all the way to ROI, then you're gonna have a tough time. Like you're gonna have some tough
Mhm.
conversations. Like when people come back to you and say you've spent all this money and like what did that turn into? Like you won't be able to justify it.
Yep. Well, it's funny because we talked about this last time, and I remember one of the AI clips that like Restream gave us was like we were talking about this, and you at the very end you were like, "Yes, but have you had the tools to be able to properly track that?" And then it like cut off the clip, and I was like, "That is a perfect cliffhanger." Because it's like you have to advocate. Like I remember at Snap, I built a custom CRM in Airtable because it was the procurement that we had.
Yeah,
Airtable's still manual. You still have to go enter everything in there, right? But
yeah,
I at least had a document of record where if I went and talked to a developer at an event and we could relook up that company and say, oh, wow, they're now in the deals process. So there's an association, right? Track the activity. Eventually, then they hopefully eventually lead to that deal. But we're talking 4, 5, 6, 7 touch points that you have to track before sometimes you
yeah,
even get to that deal point. And so it is like this wandering way of like, you have to be so diligent in your DevRel role. And then, on top of it, wear the other 50 million hats, right? So it's like,
yeah,
it's uh it's a struggle. The struggle is
yeah.
real.
I had this guy on data science. So back at Circle, I had this guy from data science, which we met once, maybe twice a week, to kind of like just go through metrics, but also go through what is the value of all these things that we're doing. What
Yep.
is the data that you're missing, and how can I help?
Mm,
Um,
that's
so you,
amazing.
you basically, and like I don't know that when I was getting into DevRel, I ever thought I would need to kind of like have a strong partnership with someone in data science and
Totally.
help them kind of like, do their job so they help me do my job. And again, it kind of goes back to the many hats that you're going to wear. Okay, like maybe you're going to have to work with data science. Like, if you think your job is only going to be like talking to product or talking to engineering, there's more,
Yeah.
because like you kind of need to make sure that you're finding the right ways to bring value.
Yeah, and that I think that takes us back around to the HR sort of like analogy, right? Of
hmm
like when you're in DevRel and you're doing a good job and you really are serving a great purpose for that company,
Yeah,
the amount, like the actual impact that you drive towards that company, but then on top of it, like all the skills. I am so thankful that I did land in DevRel because I have learned so much by force of nature, by me seeing, hey, I need to have attribution. I need to have
yeah,
whatever. I need to understand data science. I need to understand marketing. I need to work with product marketing. I need to understand product. I need to understand the engineering cycle, right? There's just so many different things that come into that. And I feel like when you can do it and you can do it well and you get the opportunity where the company has you set up for success, wow, is it just a massive learning experience, just
yeah,
massive.
yeah. And again, like unfortunately in smaller companies, like being able to do all this is a little not impossible. Like I don't think it's impossible. And again, like we are talking about large, like companies with like large scale of like sales and everything, like sales deals
Yeah.
and everything. When you're talking about like a smaller company, then maybe it's like easier to track all this. um, but yeah, it kind of like you still need to do some legwork to make sure that you're going to be able to track those things and have those conversations, and and be good at your job, or be perceived as being good at your job.
Yeah. I think one of the early things that I learned in this regard was to actually befriend sales. And I know that that sounds like, oh, why would you do that? But it's like when they have deals and they have opportunities, then when they have that coming in, right? And you're like, hey, I went to an event. Here's a few conversations. Here's someone I
Yeah,
think that you should talk to. But you have that friendship. So you're like, this person is technical, right? They don't want to have a sales call, but they're ready to hear about sort of this opportunity or this pricing, or they need to understand the security processes or the compliance or whatever, right? And so when you can befriend them, make sure they understand developers and then they understand the deals that you're bringing in, it's a beautiful partnership because
I
at all
agree.
hands, when you're celebrating it, the salesperson's like, this wasn't DevRel was instrumental, or vice
Yeah,
versa, right? Like this sales deal was something that started with DevRel, and I think that's incredibly impactful.
I very much agree. Yep.
Well, this has been lovely. I have about
Yeah.
1,200 text messages from all these different things going on. I'm like, oh my gosh, is the world on fire? What's happening? Apparently sought after during this hour and a half we've been in here.
Good. It's good.
It's always good. We have people that pick up milk because we do raw milk. And so I have a customer that's like, I'm going to be there in 20 minutes. Is it okay? I'm like, yeah, okay. I better write back to you.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, super great. This has
Cool.
been lovely.
This was
Great.
lovely.
Yeah. Are we on for next Tuesday? I don't think it's a
We
holiday or
are.
anything. Okay, amazing. Well, we'll be here, start easing into our DevRel thoughts and then leaving pretty salty. And I'm here for it.
Bye, folks.
Bye, everyone. I hope you have a fabulous rest of your week and a good 4th of July if you are celebrating.
If you're celebrating, yes.
Yeah.